Okay, so I've gotten to that point where it's cheaper and more efficient for me to have a 3D printer than not. So I've picked up an Elgoo Mars 3 and I've started printing. And there's a little something that I've figured out to begin with and hopefully help you to get over the first few fails of that difficult setup period. So if you know anything about 3D printers, you'll know that early process of getting your first print out can be a very rocky one. And if you're watching this video, you might well be suffering some failed prints, specifically some failed prints that might look like this. These little discs are probably familiar with anybody who's struggling to get their first print out and are looking to get this guy printed. So the first thing I'll say, and the single piece of quick advice that will get you printing more quickly, is don't print this as your first test print. When Elgoo say that this is a test print, this isn't like the test print that's on your printer that's great for calibrating it, but doesn't push the printer to sort of, you know, show off all of its capabilities and display it to the sort of highest degree. It's something to test it, to calibrate it, to make sure nothing is off. This is not that. This is like asking your printer to do a test print of like a full color panoramic photograph. There are great calibration prints available. I'll put a link in the description to one, the Cones of Calibration, which is great for actually setting up and testing your printer. This is more of a test, like pushing the printer to some of its extremes, and it's very bad for its first test print, and I'll run through some reasons in a minute. One of the big issues I think with the 3D printer, the Elgoo Mars 3, which is what I've got, is this is the manual for that comes with the Mars 3. It also has a PDF version on this thumb drive, which is exactly the same thing. They've got infinite space in the PDF, but they put the same very short manual through. This is the manual for my kettle. It's longer and more detailed than the one for my 3D printer, which is insane. I think they assume that you're going to go hunting for information online, which is probably why you're watching this video. Okay, so on to getting your first test print out. There are a few reasons why you might get these little thin discs. The standard reason, and the thing that a lot of the advice is going to sort of talk about if you go for it online, is that the print isn't adhering to the build plate. You run the build, the print, and you get nothing on the build plate, and one of these guys stuck to the FEP, the film at the bottom of your resin tank. That's because the test print isn't adhering to the build plate, and most of the advice you'll get is to help you get your print to adhere to the build plate. And I'll run through that advice now, just in case you haven't heard it already. So the usual advice is, first of all, to sort of run over the build plate with some fine grit sandpaper or a scouring pad or even some iron wool, just to roughen it up a bit. That's because often the build plate is very smooth and shiny and therefore doesn't give the print much to adhere to on that first print, and so it sticks to the FEP instead of the build plate. I think that's a solid piece of advice. Frankly, your build plate is probably getting up a bit scratched up by the time you've, you know, scraped off a few builds to it, so you may as well sort of roughen up a little bit because it may well help. The second piece of advice you'll often get is to lubricate the build plate, the FEP a little bit. I advise using some sort of silicone lubricant for that. That's primarily because it's widely available, because frankly it's what most sex lubricants are based on that aren't water based, so you can pick them up very easily in a lot of normal stores and shops, whereas some other lubricants like PTFE, which is a forever chemical and is a specialist chemical, silicone is just as good and you get it much more easily, and it's less harmful to the environment, so I'd shoot for that one. So that can help the test print to not adhere to the FEP. Another piece of advice is to put a couple of pieces of Scotch tape underneath the resin tank. This stops there from forming a vacuum underneath the FEP that can hold it down more tightly to the LED screen, that will stop prints from adhering to it. And that's a fairly simple fix, and that can help lots of people. And the last fix for this problem is, when leveling the build plate, the manual suggests putting a piece of paper underneath it to level to. Now, a piece of paper isn't exactly a, you know, specific thickness and width? You know, are we talking about sort of a piece of high-grade Brook Bond, or are we talking about some thin, almost see-through piece of tracing paper? So one piece of advice I've heard is to use a couple of sheets of paper to give a little bit of thickness, to give that extra width below the FEP, to again reduce the level of vacuum that you get when printing. And I've heard all of these solutions work for multiple people online, and I don't think there's any reason not to try any of them. None of them worked for me. And that's because I had a slightly different problem from just getting nothing on the build plate and nothing on the FEP. What I got was one disc stuck to the build plate and one disc stuck to the FEP. If you're getting that problem, you've got a different issue. And the issue that you've got there is the way that 3D printing works, as you probably know, is the build plate comes down to the LCD screen, and then the LCD light comes on and hardens the resin, sets the resin using a UV light. Ideally, that layer then sticks to the build plate as it lifts off, and then it comes back down, and you get another layer, and you get another layer, and you get your print. Now, most prints, most miniatures, things like that, you're going to print with a set of supports and then the miniature. So the first layer, which is extra cured, has a longer exposure time, will be a raft that's quite thick, has a long base, and then the next layer will be that support, which will be tiny and extremely thin, and so there'll be more adhesion on the build plate that has that first extra cured layer to give extra adhesion than that very thin support. So the support will be pulled off by the build plate, and everything will go lovely and very smoothly. If you look at this structure and you bear in mind that having the base significantly thicker than the next layer significantly helps to avoid fails, you might see a flaw in this as your first print. So the Elgoo version that's on the thumb drive you get will have this literally stuck straight to the build plate. So the first few layers might well stick to the build plate, and then we get to the past the first few set layers where the setting is that your 3D printer will speed up and will give less exposure time, because those other layers need less exposure time and will stick generally more securely to that first layer. What you'll find then is that there obviously isn't a huge deal of difference in between these layers of adhesion, not until you get right up here, and those few layers will just get peeled apart from your first print layers, and that's when you're getting two separate discs, one on the FEP and one on the build plate. And none of those solutions that are aimed at getting a layer onto the build plate will really help with that, because, you know, that's not the issue that you're suffering. So in order to get this printed, if you're suffering two separate disc prints, what you're going to need is to go in. Now, the Chitu box version that's on this thumb drive that you might have gotten from Elgoo is preset. It's set without knowing which resin you're using. It's set without knowing all the details of, you know, how you're printing. It's a default version of the setting. There is an STL version on that thumb drive, and you can go into Chitu box and you can reslice it and readjust the settings. So again, I'll put a link to the Elgoo recommended settings, because each different sort of resin has different setting times. And if, like me, you thought transparent is cool, transparent is interesting, you'll learn that transparent is the hardest sort of resin to set. So if you are having those two discs problem, you might have picked transparent resin like me, and that might be what's causing your issues. So I'll pop up on screen my settings that I've used in order to get this to print in transparent resin with an Elgoo Mars 3. You'll see, looking at these settings, that they're very high. So here are the settings that I use to print it, and here are the settings that the Chitu box gives you as default for the Mars 3, which I assume is what the Chitu box file on the thumb drive will be giving you to print. You'll see those numbers are very different, and the largest set of numbers are the only one that I managed to get that first print to print out with transparent resin. So you can go to those higher settings and it should print out for you. That ends up being a 12 to 13 hour long print. What you're almost certainly better served in doing is to, if you really want to get this guy printed, to know that you've done it, is to take the STL file into Chitubox, angle it up. There are plenty of videos telling you how to do that and sort of supporting it yourself. And then that should definitely help with getting the print out. If you want to print it sat on the build plate the way recommended, you're going to need to really punch up those settings. So in short, I strongly advise you, when doing test prints for your Elgoo printer, particularly if you've got transparent resin, particularly if you're seeing those two separate discs pulling out, is print something different. Download something pre-supported, a miniature, something you like the look of, and print that off, because you might well find, you'll probably find, that with the default settings, maybe adjusted up a little bit using the table that I've put into the links, you'll get a successful print when you've been failing over and over and over. If you insist on getting that rook printed out, then you're going to need to punch the settings right up, particularly for transparent resin. And that's the reason that you're getting those fails. You're getting that 2-disc fail. I'm saying that simply because I didn't see advice specifically talking about that 2-disc version of the fail. It's all the advice is about adhering one layer onto the build plate, which isn't necessarily your problem. Okay, so hopefully you can go away, you can try a different print, you can, if you must, punch the settings right up, as the ones that I've sort of shown in the video, and get that rook printed out, and then you can move on to printing something you actually want, that you're actually looking to use. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. It was a helpful piece of advice for me when I figured it out. Now I'm moving on. I'm printing loads of really lovely, you know, cool looking prints, miniatures, bits and pieces, all of which are printing so much more easily than that first Elgoo rook. I've got some other sort of learning points about some bits and pieces that you might want to pick up before your first print, or that you'll need as soon as possible, and I'll run that video in a little while. But I just thought this one is a simple piece of advice I can give to get people over a very specific hump that I haven't seen a lot of advice referring to. So hopefully this has helped somebody out, and hopefully you'll get off of that 2-disc print problem and start getting some miniatures printed out. For now, and until the next of these videos are running through the pitfalls, perils and pleasures of 3D printing, so thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.